Hello optimizers! My name is John, and in this video you are going to learn how to host a Optimizely CMS 12 website inside of a Docker container. So specifically in this video you're going to learn why this is really useful, and especially when it comes to development you're going to learn how to enable your SQL Server to allow communication from your container to your host SQL Server. We're going to look at what files you need to include, and we're going to look at file mounts. So this is going to allow you to make changes in your Docker container and easily add those updates into your source control. So all of this is going to be super useful because it's going to allow you to be the most productive version of yourself when you're working with Optimizely CMS 12, and who doesn't want that? Now, if you haven't come across one of my videos before, what you've been doing, numbskull, my name is John, and you should be subscribing to my YouTube channel. Now, I do weekly YouTube videos on things like CMS, Optimizely, and basically if you want to become the best developer you can be, this is the YouTube channel for you. So hit subscribe and be an absolute legend. So, assume we've done that, let's go over the benefits of using a Docker container to power our CMS 12 website. Let's get this party started by just talking about what is the benefit for you from using a Docker container. And it's not just to use something cool and new, there is actually a lot of benefits for your workflow. So let's start by thinking about Asp Net Framework and the most efficient way that we used to be able to work. So back in the day, in order to create a Asp Server website quickly, how I typically worked was I'd make all my coding changes. I'd probably use the Visual Studio debugger just to make sure that all my updates were working. However, if I wanted to do things like add content in the CMS, upload some images, maybe do an import export, I would create a site in IIS. I'd point my site in IIS to my folder structure in the CMS, and then I'd use that as a persistent and quick and easy way to access the CMS. Having to open up a Visual Studio instance and run the debugger each time you need to make a CMS tweak, it's just not very effective. If you're doing a 6-month, 12-month project, having to constantly do this wastes loads of time. Now, back in the day of Asp Net Framework, all you'd have to do is fire up your IIS instance and point it to your web root. And this is an example of a Asp Server 11 web root. So you can see we have our web config, we have our bin folder, we have basically all the files in here, so we can all work in a nice self-contained way. Now, one of the often overlooked things when it comes to ASP.NET 5 is it actually adds in an extra step into the process. And for CMS development, this extra step is kind of annoying. So this is an example of a CMS 12 web root. And as you can see, we don't have things like our web config here. We don't have a load of the files that we actually need. So what happens when we're doing development using ASP.NET 5 and CMS 12 is you have to go into Visual Studio, you have to do a publish, you'll probably publish to a folder, you'll still set up IIS kind of the same, however you'll be pointing your IIS instance to this extra website folder that your publish is going to create. And as you can see when we're starting to look in this publish folder, we've got things like our web config, we have all the license.config, we have all the files we need. So in this instance, every single time you want to start doing stuff in the CMS, using IIS is kind of a pain now because you have to remember to do a publish. Also, when you start accessing the site via IIS, if you say upload an image, the images will be uploaded into this website folder. So they will not be added into the solution where you're writing your code. So this means that you're potentially going to have to remember to do a publish each time you do a change. You're also going to have to remember to copy the files back from the website folder into your solution so you can add them into Git. And this is just a pain. However, this is where the Docker file can actually come in and make life easier. So when you're actually working within a container, instead of having to go through this janky sort of process, what you can do instead is set up mounts inside your container. So when you're starting to upload images and all that kind of good stuff, what will happen is the updates will automatically be pushed into your Git repository, into your solution root. So then it's much more easier to then start adding files into your source control. Also means that when you fire up your development environment, you're going to have all the images and all the assets. So when it comes to CMS 12, my recommendation is nowadays in your development environment, ditch off IIS and just work in a container because it's going to allow you to be a lot more productive. So this is the reason why we want to do Docker containers. The next step is getting it all working. And the first thing we're going to do is set up our SQLs. Your Optimizely CMS 12 relies on a database to work. So what we'll need to do is make sure that connection string inside our container can talk back to the SQL Server on our host machine. And as you'd expect by Microsoft, this is disabled, so you'll need to configure it and able to allow it to work. And in order to make this work, you're going to use this SQL Management Configuration tool. It's not the easiest thing to find. Assuming that you have SQL Server and SQL Management Studio installed, you want to go to Windows, you want to go to System 32, and then from here, you want to scroll to the bottom somewhere, type in SQL, and then you'll find eventually something which is called the SQL Server Manager. So I've got number 15 here. Let's open this up. Now from here, you're going to have to do a few things. So the first thing is go to this SQL network configuration, and you're going to want to find the SQL instance that you have installed. So I have 3 versions, but the one I care about is the SQL Express. Now the first thing you need to do is make sure this TCP IP thing is enabled. By default, it will be disabled. So just simply click on that and make sure that we have enabled equals yes. We also want to make sure that this listen all is also yes. And by default, that will be turned on. Now, in order to make sure that your connection string is working, you probably want to test this first, because trying to do this stuff within a container just wastes a bit of time. So what you want to do is double click on this TCP IP. As you can see here, we also have this IP addresses tab. And from here, if you scroll down the bottom, you'll see that you'll have this TCP dynamic port. And this is basically the port that your SQL Server is running on. Now your configuration might be a little different. You can see that we have all these TC ports here. So basically just scroll through here and then you can basically find which one you want to map. So this is 63636. After you make all these changes, you want to click on SQL Server Instances. You want to find your one at the top here, right click on it and then do a restart or stop start. And then as soon as it reboots, you're going to get these new changes. Now the next thing that you'll probably need to do is this IP config. So let's open this. So you'll need your internal IP address to get this working. Your internal IP address can be found by doing IP config, and then in the IPv4 for addresses field, you'll find an address which starts with 192, then copy this value. So mine's 192.168.0.25. Next, we want to fire up SQL Server Management Studio and basically just test that all of this is working. As I said, testing it this way is going to save you a load of time and pain. So as you can see in my SQL Server, what I've got here is my IP address, so 192.168.0.25, a comma, and then the port number, which was 636363. I want to use SQL Server authentication, and then I want to use the username and password that you're using in your connection string. Clicking on that should hopefully fire up a connection, and as you can see, I've got access to my CMS 12 database. So now I know that my SQL Server is working. The next step is to think about file permissions. So going back to my web roots, I'm going to go to my solution, which is in code, CMS 12 SaaS site. What you want to do is make sure that there's basically your CMS root has the correct folder permissions. If you don't do this, when we set up the file amount within the Docker container, things won't work, you won't get errors, and it will take you ages to figure this stuff out. So what you want to do in here is click on edit. The easy option is to add everyone, and because we're working with our development, who cares? And then make sure it's got full control, so read and write. You also probably want to make sure, if you want to be a bit more fine-grained, that there's one which is called Docker users. There we go. You can add that if you want to be a bit more great with your permissions, but you know, this is my local development environment, who cares? Click OK, make sure it all runs through. Job's a good one. And that's pretty much all the prerequisites you need to do. The next step is to create that Docker file. We're getting to that point where we're about to create some code, so this is a great reminder for me to you to say, if you want to get access to this Docker file that you're about to see getting created and the commands I'm about to run, you can come over to my GitHub, which is GitHub John D. Jones. Be a legend while you're there. Subscribe and follow me. Someone saw my last video and they made it to number 100, and that guy or gal, whoever you are, legend. And then from here, right down the bottom, you can see that I pinned it. Optimize the CMS 12, V12, starter kits. Yeah, you can clone it. You'll get access to everything you're about to see. So the first thing that we're going to do when we're setting up our Docker file is create a file within our solution. It's going to be called Docker file. So capital D, lowercase f. Now, when it comes to this type of developments, the important thing to think about is what do you need to add into your container. So in my example, I've got my web root, which is called CMS. I've got a class library, which is called cms.core. Now, we also need to include two other things. So first, if you want your website to work, you're going to probably have to want to copy the license.config. If you don't know how to get this, just type episerver development license developer, there you go. And you can find a developer one over at license.episerver.com. There's also a super awesome tutorial written by an absolute great guy right underneath it. So yeah, there's no excuse for not being able to do this. So assuming you've got your license, you want to make sure that gets copied into your Docker container. You also need to make sure that this NuGet.config gets copied in. Now, the reason for this is that when we're working with a Docker container, what we need to do is copy all of our files into the container. We do a .NET publish, and then that's the thing which will get hosted inside the container. Now, when we're using Episerver, Optimizely, whatever you want to call it, we get all of our main core NuGet dependencies from the Episerver specific NuGet feed. So we need to make sure that you have a NuGet config, and this NuGet config needs to include the Episerver feed. So as you can see here, we've got package sources, NuGet, including the normal NuGet one, and then we also have Episerver, and then the feed is http nuget.episerver.com/feed/packages.svc. So if you do not copy this NuGet.config, your build process isn't going to work, so that's kind of key. Now, as you can see, I've got my Docker file, and our Docker file is basically split into two instances. So don't worry if it looks a bit confusing. You have one half, which basically tells the container what we're going to copy in from our solution directory. And then we have the second half, which basically says how we're going to instantiate that image. So the first part is all about copying stuff into our container. Now we're going to define a base image. So for example, we can use the .NET SDK 5.0. It's also possible to do the .NET ASP.NET 5 one. I just use this one because it's easier. Then we're going to set our working directory to source. And then as you can see, we're just copying and doing basic stuff here. So we're copying in our NuGet config into the root directory. We're also copying in the license file to the root directory. Then I'm copying in the CMS core project. And we do this by pointing our Docker container at the project file. And then we just do a .NET restore. So because we've already pulled in our NuGet.config, this is going to have the Episerver NuGet feed. So this is going to work as we expect. Next, we're going to pull in my main website and the web root. So we're going to put in the website CS.proj file, and then we can do the same .NET restore here. And then finally, you just do a copy ... and then you do the run.NET publish. You're going to publish things based on the web root. We're going to use the release environment target, and then I'm going to copy everything into app/out. So yeah, as you can see, this is basically just loads of setup tasks. Now the next thing we're going to do is define how the image is going to be instantiated. So again, we do from, and we're going to use the .NET ASP.NET 5 based container image. We're going to set the working directory to app now, because remember we've copied all of the output for our website to this app directory. We're going to expose port 80. So obviously when we're trying to access a website, we're going to need a web server, and we're going to communicate through the port 80. Next, I've set two environment variables. One, which is basically saying use the Docker configuration or the Docker release, and another one which is using the ASP.NET Core URLs, and this is just going to add in port 80 to the end. So this environment thing that I've created, this can be anything you want to name it. Typically, you know, it might be release, production, staging. I've just created one called Docker. Now, when you are doing this, you basically need to make sure that your environment on your website is actually going to pick up these files and these changes. And the way that we do this is inside program.cs. So as you can see in my program.cs, I'm loading in my app settings.json. This flag here, which says false, means that it's mandatory. So it's either optional or mandatory. After that, I'm then reading in my the environment variable that I'm passing in. I'm writing it to the log so we can see it within our container. And then I'm using this builder.add.json file. I'm doing app settings with the environment. I'm saying this is optional, so it doesn't have to exist. However, what this is going to do is this is going to apply all the changes which is in my app settings.docker on top of my app settings.json. And if we look in app settings.docker, you can see that I've just defined the epi server connection string that we tested early. So I hope this all makes sense to you. Basically, all you need to do is copy these 3 lines and make sure they exist within your program.cs, and then you can just pass in flags and then create any app settings you want to work. It's super simple. Again, it's just a bit different to how we did it with the web.config, but the process is kind of the same. Now, after we've got our instructions, it's time to build our image. We finish the process off by doing a copy. So we're going to copy the build output into our destination. You also need to copy the license file over. So we've copied it into the container here, and now we're copying it from the root of the container into the app directory. And then we've also need to finally give the entry point. So when we actually try and run the container, this is the thing which is going to run. So we're going to use the .NET CLI, and the entry point to my application is called cms.dll. Obviously yours is going to be based on the namespace of your website project. So yeah, it might look a little bit intimidating at first. However, if you split it into 2, it kind of makes sense. Now, looking inside of my web root, you can see that I've already got a CMS 12 container fired up. So let's delete that. So what we've got here is the terminal. There we go. So in order to create an image from our Docker file, you use the docker build command. So we're going to do docker build, and we're going to tag it as optimize the 12 starter kit, and then you finish it off with a T. Clicking on this is going to go through and start building it. Now, if everything has gone according to plan, you're going to get it's all going to look like this. It's going to create the image for you, and all's peachy. Let's be honest, when you're setting up for the first time or the first few times, you're going to see some errors in here. So you want to go through and start debugging stuff to see what happens. Now, one handy tip, which you probably can't see as easily, is that if you do a docker cp, what you can do is docker cp your image name, so mine's CMS 12 in this example, and you can say copy everything from the web root into app. So let's say I'm doing this. Actually, I haven't created my container yet. So after you've created your container, you then need to create an instance. So you can do your docker run. I'll go through this in more detail in a minute because there's a lot here. But yeah, basically you do a docker run. After you do a docker run, it's going to create the image for you. So as you can see, it's running. So to debug, you can do a docker cp CMS 12, which is the name of my container. You can see that I'm creating it there. And then I'm going to say /app. So if I do this, now when I go into Windows, you can see that I've got this folder called app. And if I look in here, this is going to be the complete contents of my Docker container. So using that docker cp is really useful for when you're debugging this stuff. It does take a lot of trial and error. So if I look in the app folder, you can see that all of my files are in here, and my license.config's in here. So this can be a bit of a pain to get working. But yeah, as you can see, I've got my app data folder. I've got my blobs have been copied over. So yeah, everything looks like it's working, and it's okay. So let's go back to this docker run command. So as you can see, there's a lot going on here. And let's open this up in its own file, just so you have an idea of what's going on. So yeah, in order to create a container based on an image, use docker run. Now I always use the -d flag, and this basically means run the image or run this command as a background task. So if you don't put the -d command, what will happen is your terminal will lock up and you have to close the terminal, open up again, which is a massive pain when you're doing development. So yeah, -d is going to help you out, it's your friend. Next, we're going to do a port mapping. So using the -p command, we're going to map a port on our host machine to port 80 within the Docker container. So if I go to my containers right here, you can see that I'm accessing it using 8081. So localhost 8081. And this is the thing here which is doing that mapping. So your 8081 could be anything you want. However, just want to make sure it's not being used on your host machine. So as an example, say if I get rid of my 8081, I've actually got IIS working over port 80. So as you can see, this is going to my IIS. And then as soon as I add in my extra ports, so 8081, I'm then going via the Docker container. So this is all great. This is everything, that I want it to do. Now, next up, I'm going to create that mount. Now, as we saw a minute ago, that whenever you're uploading images into your website, what will happen is everything is going to get created in this app data blobs folder. So what we want to do is create a mount. And a mount is basically a mapping from your container to a folder in your host environment. So I'm going to map my app data. And the reason why I'm doing this is that whenever I upload an image in my container, it's then going to get uploaded into my website. So my container is going to be running, doing its thing, having the time of its little life. And then whenever anything is updated in the container, what will happen is this folder within my solution is going to get updated as well. So this is one of the main reasons why using a Docker container is so super useful, is that it's going to allow you to easily then commit these files to source control. As you can see, it's in with my Git repo, because I've got my .git folder. So yeah, adding stuff like this, super simple. Now after that, you want to basically give your image a tag. So I'm going to call mine CMS12. This is basically just for debugging to make things easier. But as you can see here, my container is called CMS12. You don't have to do it. It's just going to make your life easier. If you don't do this, you're going to get like a random name like I'm a unicorn or like green tomato or something crazy like that. After that, you give the name of the container. So the name of the container, remember in our images, is Opti12 Stars Kit. So that's just that mapping. And then I'm just going to pass in this Asp Net core environment Docker flag. So this is a thing which is then telling us to run the Docker set of files. So in that app settings.docker.config. So yeah, even though it looks like it's quite a lot, I think when you start breaking it down, it's not that difficult. You just do Docker run, give it a name, give it the image, and then pass in some settings. And then doing all that, as you can see, we've got this Docker file. It's persistently hosted. As long as Docker's running, I can constantly access it. I can easily access the CMS. Life is amazing. Boom! There we have it. You now know how to create a container and a CMS12 website, make them live in perfect symbiosis, harmony. If you are doing CMS12 development, I 100% recommend that you take the time and you get this Docker stuff working, because it is going to make you a lot more efficient. Now, as you can see, setting up that base Docker file is a lot more complicated compared to just simply hosting a site in IIS. However, the time and effort is worthwhile. And the great news is that as soon as you have that base Docker file set up and running, it's very easy to add in other sites, it's very easy to tweak it. So it is worth the investment. Now, if you have enjoyed this content, you can do me some favors. First, if you didn't mind, smash the like button. Now, I'm not saying that just for the sake of doing it, but it basically allows me to know two things. The first one is that you enjoy this content and you want to see me do more type of optimizely content. So that helps me there. The other one is that it helps the YouTube algorithm show my video to more people. So it's taken me a while to make this video. If you want to show some appreciation, I'd appreciate it if you do like. Now, if you want to learn more about Optimizely, you like these videos, this is your jam, then hit the subscribe button so you can see more videos in my series and in the future, and it makes you a legend. Also, I do a Sunday weekly newsletter. It's free. You'll get updates on industry news, basically things I found interesting this week, and updates to my content. Yeah, you can subscribe easily if you want to as well. It's all through an automated program, so yeah, that's also a thing. Then I do have a Optimizely CMS development book. It's available below, so yeah, check that out if you want to support me in a different way. Otherwise, I hope you're having a great time wherever you are in the world. Hope you've got some value from this video, and until next time, happy coding.